She was called the most beautiful woman in Europe. A queen whose hair flowed like rivers of gold, whose waist seemed impossibly delicate, whose face was painted into portraits and whispered about in every royal court. To the world, she was Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, the dazzling wife of Emperor Franz Joseph, the living embodiment of fairy tale monarchy. But behind the portraits, behind the diamonds and tiaras, lay a woman suffocated by protocol, haunted by tragedy, and pursued relentlessly by fate. Hers is not the story of a fairy tale princess who lived happily ever after. It is the story of a woman trapped in a gilded cage, who longed for freedom yet could never escape the shadow of her crown. Sisi's life was a theater of contradictions. She was adored by the people, yet isolated within her own palace. She had beauty that poets worshipped, yet she despised her reflection, spending hours, sometimes days, obsessed with her appearance. She was the empress of one of the greatest powers in Europe, yet powerless in her own household, crushed beneath the will of her domineering mother-in-law and the rigid weight of the Habsburg dynasty. And then came the blows of fate, the Mayerling tragedy, where her only son and heir shot himself alongside his young mistress, leaving a kingdom stunned and a mother shattered beyond repair. From that day forward, Sisi dressed only in black, a living monument to grief. She became a wandering shadow, traveling restlessly through Europe, as if hoping that in flight she might outpace her sorrow. But destiny had one final cruelty in store. In 1898, in the peaceful lakeside city of Geneva, an anarchist's blade pierced her chest. At first, no one even realized she had been struck. She rose, walked, and only moments later collapsed, blood spreading silently beneath her gown. It was a death both senseless and symbolic. The world's most admired empress brought down not by armies or courts, but by a solitary hand in the street. This is the story of Empress Elisabeth, Sisi, the woman who embodied beauty, but whose life was written in loneliness, grief, and blood. Long before she became the most admired woman in Europe, Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie of Bavaria, Sisi, was just a girl running barefoot through meadows, chasing butterflies in the foothills of the Alps. Born in 1837 in Munich to Duke Maximilian of Bavaria and Princess Ludovica of Bavaria, she was not raised to be an empress. She was the fourth daughter in a sprawling, eccentric family, where titles mattered far less than freedom. Her father, Duke Maximilian, was known as one of the most unconventional nobles in Germany. A man of music and poetry, he preferred taverns to ballrooms, folk songs to courtly anthems. He would play his zither for peasants and wander through the countryside dressed like a commoner, scandalizing his peers. It was under this bohemian influence that young Elizabeth grew. She learned to ride horses with the fearlessness of a boy, to climb trees with scraped knees, and to disappear for hours into the Bavarian forests. Her mother, Ludovica, was stricter, anxious to secure good marriages for her daughters in a Europe where dynasties were stitched together through matrimony. But even she could not contain Elizabeth's wild spirit. Unlike her elder sisters, who were trained in etiquette, Sisi loathed embroidery lessons and courtly manners. Her beauty, still in its raw, unpolished state, was matched by a free, untamed energy that set her apart. It was this untamed spirit that would one day enchant an emperor. In 1853, when Elizabeth was just 15, her family arranged for her elder sister, Helena, to be presented as a bride to Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. The plan was clear. Helena, serious and dutiful, was perfect for the rigid Habsburg court. Elizabeth was brought along only as company, an afterthought. But destiny has a cruel sense of irony. When the young emperor laid eyes on Elizabeth, he was struck instantly. She was nothing like the carefully groomed princesses paraded before him. With her long chestnut hair, shy smile, and aura of innocence mixed with wildness, she seemed to him almost ethereal, untouched by the stiffness of court life. Helena might have been the candidate, but Franz Joseph's heart betrayed the script. He declared he would marry Elizabeth, or no one at all. For Sisi, this was no dream come true. At 16, she was suddenly thrust into a role she neither wanted nor prepared for. She wept on the eve of her wedding, terrified of the golden prison awaiting her in Vienna. The carefree girl who had once galloped through alpine meadows was about to become the most scrutinized woman in Europe. The Habsburg court was a universe away from Bavaria. It was a world of suffocating protocol, endless ceremonies, and spies in every corner. Elizabeth, so used to freedom, found herself trapped in a labyrinth of rules. She had to rise at fixed hours, dress in elaborate gowns, bow before dowagers, and obey her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who quickly seized control of her new daughter-in-law's children, declaring Elizabeth too inexperienced to raise them. For a girl barely past childhood, this was devastating. Sisi grew increasingly isolated, her natural shyness mistaken for arrogance. To cope, she clung fiercely to her few sources of control: her appearance, her body, her image. She began a lifelong obsession with beauty, dieting strictly, exercising relentlessly, and spending hours, sometimes up to 3 or 4 a day, having her legendary hair brushed and styled. Her waist shrank to an almost unnatural thinness, bound tightly by corsets. Rumors spread across Europe of the empress who ate almost nothing, who walked for miles daily, who wore black veils and starved herself into legend. But beneath the glamour, this was a girl desperately fighting for some measure of autonomy in a life that had been stolen from her. Even in these early years, signs of tragedy hovered. Elizabeth, though admired for her beauty, was increasingly restless, yearning to escape the suffocating palace walls. She began writing melancholic poetry, filled with themes of death, loneliness, and the futility of life. Her words revealed not an empress basking in glory, but a prisoner, a soul clawing at invisible bars. She was not yet the black-clad widow of Mayerling, nor the wandering shadow of her later years. But even in youth, Sisi's fate was already inscribed: to be adored, to be trapped, and to be broken. The little girl of Bavaria, who once sang folk songs with her father and rode through wild fields, was gone. In her place stood an empress, beautiful, fragile, and already beginning to drown in the role history had chosen for her. Vienna, the beating heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had seen many queens, but none like her. From the moment Empress Elisabeth stepped into the gilded halls of the Hofburg Palace, whispers spread like wildfire. She was no ordinary consort. She was luminous, otherworldly. Painters rushed to capture her likeness, but even the most skilled artists confessed they could not do her justice. Her chestnut hair fell past her knees, so heavy it took hours each morning for her maids to untangle it. Her waist, tightly bound, measured scarcely 50 centimeters, an impossible figure that made her the envy of Europe's elite. When she entered a ballroom, conversation stopped. Men lowered their voices. Women stared with envy. It was as though a goddess had stepped down from Olympus, draped in silk and diamonds. But Sisi's beauty was no accident. It was an empire she built with iron discipline. Every day began with ritual. Long walks, sometimes 20 miles across palace gardens, regardless of the weather. Rigid diets consisting of broth, oranges, and the occasional glass of milk. Hours spent at the gymnasium she had installed in the palace, performing acrobatics, lifting weights, practicing gymnastics like a soldier in training. And then the hair. A crown of chestnut silk brushed for hours until it shimmered like polished bronze under the chandeliers. She was not just admired, she was worshipped. Poets dedicated verses to her. Nobles whispered rumors of her supernatural allure. Some even claimed she had discovered the secret to eternal youth, that her slender figure and porcelain skin were proof she was not of this world. The legend of Sisi, the eternal beauty, spread far beyond Vienna, reaching Paris, London, and the farthest corners of Europe. Yet with every adoring gaze, with every flattering poem, Elizabeth felt the weight of chains tightening around her. She became less a woman and more a spectacle. A living icon whose duty was not to speak, not to rule, but simply to be seen. Among the people of the empire, she was beloved. When she traveled through the streets in her carriage, crowds gathered, hailing her as the Angel of Mercy. Unlike many royals, she showed genuine compassion for the poor, visiting hospitals in secret and funding schools for orphans. To the common folk, Sisi was not just a queen, she was hope draped in velvet. But inside the palace, she was a stranger. The rigid Habsburg court despised her independent spirit, her refusal to bend entirely to protocol. Archduchess Sophie, her mother-in-law, still controlled her children, humiliating Elizabeth by treating her as an unfit mother. Ministers dismissed her as frivolous, obsessed only with beauty. Even her husband, Franz Joseph, adored her but was perpetually distracted by affairs of state. Thus, Sisi lived in a paradox, adored by millions, yet profoundly alone. Behind the shimmering gowns and dazzling portraits, Elisabeth carried a growing darkness. She wrote poetry in secret, verses filled with despair and yearning for freedom. "I am a seagull," she once wrote, "trapped in golden chains." The world saw perfection. She saw a prison. It was in this period that her love of travel began. She escaped Vienna whenever possible, seeking refuge in the landscapes of Hungary, the warm shores of Corfu, or the Italian lakes. She rode horses with unmatched skill, galloping across plains as though pursued by unseen demons. Wherever she went, she drew crowds, her legend expanding with each journey. But she was not running toward something. She was running away. By the late 1860s, Elisabeth was no longer just an empress. She was a myth. Painters depicted her as a Greek goddess, poets compared her to Venus, and the people whispered her name as though invoking a spirit. And yet, within this myth lay the seeds of tragedy. For every hour she spent preserving her beauty, time crept forward mercilessly. For every cheer of the crowd, the silence of her inner world grew louder. She had everything the world could offer: wealth, adoration, glory. But none of it could fill the emptiness clawing at her soul. Elisabeth was at the height of her fame, the most admired woman in Europe. But as the lights of the ballroom sparkled around her, shadows began to gather. For even the brightest star cannot shine forever, and Sisi's story was only beginning to darken. By the late 1870s, the radiant star of Vienna had begun to dim. Empress Elisabeth, once the embodiment of youthful beauty and grace, was slowly transforming into a shadow. Though her portraits still adorned palaces and her myth still enchanted the masses, Sisi herself was slipping further into melancholy, consumed by grief, isolation, and an obsession with death. Tragedy stalked Elisabeth like a phantom. Her first daughter, Sophie, had died in infancy during a royal tour to Hungary. The loss marked her deeply, but it was only the beginning. Each new blow tightened sorrow's grip around her. Her marriage, already strained by protocol and Franz Joseph's endless duties, grew colder. Though he loved her with a kind of desperate loyalty, his devotion could not heal her despair. Elisabeth increasingly withdrew, traveling ceaselessly across Europe as if she could outrun fate itself. Her journals from this time reveal chilling insights into her mind. She wrote of longing for the peace of the grave, of envying those freed from the burdens of existence. She seemed less an empress and more a restless spirit, her soul tethered loosely to the world. Then, in 1889, came the catastrophe that shattered what remained of her fragile world: the death of Crown Prince Rudolf, her only son and the heir to the throne. The story of Mayerling remains one of the most infamous royal scandals of the 19th century. Rudolf, tormented by personal demons, his marriage failing, and suffocated by imperial expectations, was found dead alongside his young mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, in a hunting lodge. The official explanation was suicide. The whispers, however, spoke of murder, conspiracy, or even a suicide pact born from forbidden passion. For Elisabeth, none of the details mattered. What mattered was this: her son, her last hope for meaning, had chosen death. From that day forward, she dressed only in black. Veils shrouded her face, turning the once luminous empress into a figure of mourning, a walking monument to grief. Court observers began calling her the Black Queen. She avoided public appearances whenever possible, speaking little, smiling almost never. The empress who had once captivated Europe with her beauty now seemed to embody death itself. Elisabeth's grief drove her to wander ceaselessly. She roamed the shores of Corfu, the mountains of Switzerland, the promenades of Italy. Wherever she went, she moved like a ghost, her figure veiled, her face hidden from curious eyes. Those who saw her spoke of an otherworldly presence. Some described her as a phantom queen, drifting silently through hotel corridors, her black gowns whispering against marble floors. Children sometimes fled from her, frightened by her skeletal thinness and hollowed eyes. To others, she seemed tragic but strangely magnetic, as though her sorrow itself was a crown. Her obsession with beauty never faded, but it took a darker turn. She clung desperately to her strict diets and brutal exercise regimes, but now they seemed less about vanity and more about punishing herself, about controlling the only thing left within her grasp. She once declared, "I wish to vanish like a shadow." And indeed, she seemed to be vanishing, piece by piece. Elisabeth became fascinated with death, particularly violent death. She read about executions, about murders, about tragic heroines of myth and history. She compared herself to Iphigenia, sacrificed by her family, and to Medea, cursed by destiny. In her poems, she fantasized about release, about freedom found only in the grave. It was as if she foresaw her own violent end. In one haunting line, she wrote, "The dagger will find me. I shall not resist." The world still adored her. Crowds still gathered to catch a glimpse of the veiled empress. But the woman beneath the veil was already gone. In her final years, Elizabeth became a symbol of contradiction, the most admired woman in Europe, yet the most profoundly alone. Her beauty, once her greatest weapon, had become her prison. Her crown, once a source of glory, had become a chain. The Black Queen wandered from palace to palace, from hotel to hotel, with no home, no peace, and no future. She had lost her daughter, her freedom, and now her son. Only death remained to claim her. And death was waiting. On the morning of September 10, 1898, the city of Geneva awakened to a tranquil scene. Lake Léman shimmered like glass, its surface kissed by sunlight, while carriages rattled along cobbled streets. But destiny, ever cruel in its timing, had marked this day for one of the most shocking tragedies in European history. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi, the Black Queen, had arrived quietly in Switzerland, traveling under the pseudonym Countess of Hohenems. She sought anonymity, as she often did in her later years, desperate to shed the crushing weight of her crown. Accompanied only by a single lady-in-waiting, she lodged at the Hotel Beau Rivage, a luxurious refuge overlooking the lake. What she did not know was that a predator was watching. Lurking in Geneva was Luigi Lucchini, an Italian anarchist with no personal quarrel against Elizabeth. He had planned to assassinate a member of royalty as a political statement, a symbolic act against monarchies themselves. Initially, his target had been another prince. But when fate delivered the Empress of Austria, one of the most famous women in the world, into his path, he saw opportunity. He armed himself with a crude weapon, a sharpened needle file, little more than a long piece of steel. It was not the weapon of a professional assassin but of a desperate man determined to make history through blood. That afternoon, Elizabeth left her hotel to catch a steamship across the lake. She walked along the promenade, dressed simply, her face hidden by the perpetual black veil. To onlookers, she seemed like any other grieving widow. Few realized they were in the presence of an empress. Suddenly, from the crowd, Lucchini lunged. He struck her in the chest with his improvised blade, so quickly and subtly that at first even Elizabeth herself did not realize what had happened. She staggered but regained her composure, brushing off her gown as though she had merely been jostled. Witnesses recalled her murmuring faintly, "What has happened to me?" before continuing her walk. Moments later, her strength failed. She collapsed on the gangway of the steamer. Panic erupted. Her lady-in-waiting and bystanders rushed to lift her, carrying her back to the hotel. It was only then that they discovered the truth. Lucchini's file had pierced her heart. For an hour, doctors tried in vain to save her. They opened her corset, revealing the wound. Blood soaked her gown, staining the very black fabric she had worn in mourning since Mayerling. Elizabeth, unconscious, was laid upon a bed at the Beau Rivage. As the room filled with chaos, the clattering of instruments, the hushed voices of attendants, the Empress slipped quietly into death. At 2:10 p.m., Elizabeth of Austria was declared dead. The irony was bitter. A woman who had spent her life obsessed with death, writing poems about daggers and dark release, had finally met her fate exactly as she had imagined, not in her palace, not in her bed, but struck down violently in public, her blood spilled before strangers. News of her assassination spread like wildfire across Europe. Crowds gathered outside the Hofburg in Vienna, stunned and grief-stricken. Newspapers carried black borders, their headlines screaming of the Empress's fate. For millions, it was inconceivable that the legendary Sisi, so untouchable, so ethereal, had been killed by a simple man with a file. But for those who had known her intimately, it felt almost inevitable. Elizabeth had walked for years in the shadow of death. She had courted it, written about it, longed for it. Now, at last, it had claimed her. If her life had been a poem, her death was the final stanza, cruelly beautiful in its tragedy. Imagine the scene. The lake shimmering in the distance, the sun piercing through clouds, and in the middle of it all, a black-veiled empress collapsing in slow motion as her heart was pierced. A queen who had spent decades as a phantom, finally becoming one. Her coffin was returned to Vienna, draped in imperial banners. The people lined the streets in silence, their grief heavy and collective. She was buried in the imperial crypt beside generations of Habsburgs, but her story was far too vivid to be contained in marble and stone. Even in death, Elizabeth was larger than life. She had lived as Europe's most admired beauty, she had suffered as its loneliest queen, and she had died as its most tragic heroine. The dagger had indeed found her, and she had not resisted. Elizabeth of Austria did not simply die that afternoon in Geneva. She became immortal. In the decades that followed, Sisi's image was carved into Europe's collective memory, at once dazzling and haunting. Painters, poets, and later filmmakers seized upon her story, the breathtaking beauty who had everything, yet nothing, the queen who wore diamonds like armor, yet lived as a prisoner in her own palace, the empress adored by millions, yet abandoned by happiness. Her legend transcended politics. To the people, she was not just a Habsburg consort, she was a tragic heroine, a woman crushed beneath the gilded weight of monarchy. In her diaries and poetry, scholars later found the raw voice of a soul suffocated by duty, reaching desperately for freedom. Her words echoed across centuries, "I shall vanish like a shadow." And in truth, she did, yet her shadow remains. Modern culture reimagined her endlessly. Films in the 20th century romanticized her as a fairy tale princess, her gowns sparkling, her smile radiant. But historians remind us of the darker truth. Behind the glittering ballrooms was a woman who carried unbearable grief, who courted death, and who was ultimately consumed by it. Sisi's legacy is paradoxical. She is remembered as the most beautiful empress of her age, yet also as a ghost haunting her own legend. She embodied the eternal tension between power and fragility, freedom and duty, light and darkness. Even today, her story resonates because it mirrors a timeless truth. Beauty can dazzle the world, but it cannot shield the soul. In the end, Elizabeth was not merely a queen in a golden cage. She was a woman whose longing for escape became her destiny. And perhaps that is why her myth endures. Because in her, we see both the dream and the nightmare of glory.